It seems like nowadays, with the world being so unpredictable, people are really craving like a solid foundation, some guidance to help them figure things out.
Yeah, definitely. And that search for stability and direction is something we're diving into today.
Right. Our focus is Pope Francis.
And we'll be looking at him through the lens of an upcoming biography by a prominent Canadian Catholic writer, Michael W. Higgins.
Awesome. So what kind of material are we working with today?
We've got some pretty fascinating stuff to unpack. We have excerpts from Higgins's own writing in the tablet, where he offers his personal take on Pope Francis.
Okay.
Plus, we'll be drawing on news articles from the tablet itself. These articles offer on-the-ground accounts of various events and give us a feel for how the Pope operates in real-world situations. It's a really well-rounded set of sources.
Interesting. And what's the big question we want to tackle for our listeners today?
The big question we're wrestling with is how Pope Francis can be seen as both a disruptor, someone who shakes things up, and a figure of mercy and unity within the Catholic Church.
Yeah, that's a really interesting tension. It's not every day you see those qualities combined so strongly in a single person.
Absolutely. And to really get a grasp of this, we'll be looking at specific examples and examining the shifts in theological thought that underpin all of this.
Sounds like a plan. Okay, so let's jump right in. This idea of Pope Francis as a disruptor pope, that's how Higgins describes him, right?
Right. And Higgins kicks this off with a pretty powerful contrast.
Okay.
He talks about an experience Father Bill Burke had at a Corpus Christi Mass in Florida about 15 years ago. This was before Pope Francis's influence had really taken hold.
Gotcha.
What really struck Father Burke was the homily, which was extremely exclusionary. The priest actually went on to list groups of people he considered unworthy of receiving communion.
Wow.
Yeah. The list included divorced people, couples cohabiting without being married, gay individuals, anyone who wasn't opposed to abortion, and those who hadn't recently gone to confession.
So essentially, a lot of people were excluded. It seems like a pretty hardline approach, a very clear message about who's in and who's out.
Exactly.
Then, Higgins puts this story side by side with a very different one that Father Burke heard from a friend in Alberta.
Oh, right. This one's a powerful example of a different attitude. So the friend was babysitting her grandniece and took her to Mass. Then the child's father came to pick her up and ended up staying for the service.
Okay.
Well, during communion, the little girl took her dad's hand and led him up to receive. But he hesitated. He told the priest that he hadn't been to Mass in over 30 years.
I can imagine that feeling.
But instead of turning him away, the priest just put the host in his hand, smiled, and said, "Welcome home."
That's incredible. Such a simple gesture, but so meaningful. It really paints a different picture of the church, doesn't it?
Yes. And Higgins makes the point that this act of welcome embodies what he calls Francis Church. The idea of the church being like a field hospital for the wounded and a sanctuary for anyone who feels distant or excluded.
So we're seeing not just a change in tone, but a whole shift in how the church understands its purpose, moving away from being a gatekeeper and toward being a more welcoming community.
Exactly. And it's important to understand the context here. Higgins connects both Father Burke's perspective and Pope Francis's approach back to their shared theological roots.
Oh, interesting.
He points out that both men are spiritual sons of Roncalli, which means they're deeply influenced by the Second Vatican Council. That was a pivotal period of renewal and openness within the Catholic Church back in the mid-20th century.
Right. Makes sense. So they come from a similar background, but their interpretations seem quite different.
Precisely. And this leads us to the idea of Francis as a Peter, the figure responsible for upholding tradition and unity within the Church. But he seems to be going about it in a very different way.
Yeah, and Higgins gets into Francis's fundamental convictions about theology. This is where it gets really fascinating, I think.
Yes, definitely. Francis strongly believes that theology has to be relational rather than disembodied.
What does that actually mean?
It means that it needs to be rooted in lived experience and relationships, rather than starting with abstract ideas and trying to impose those on people's lives. He also emphasizes the importance of a posteriori theology over a priori theology.
Okay, so in plain English, what does that mean? I'm not a theologian.
Basically, it means theology should start with real-world observations and experiences and work backward, rather than starting with abstract principles and then trying to apply them to reality. In other words, start with what people are actually going through, not just theoretical ideas.
That makes sense. It's about grounding theology in the messiness of real life.
Exactly. And this ties in perfectly with the ideas of Emil Chacuda, an Argentine theologian Higgins discusses.
Okay, what does she have to say?
Well, she argues that for Francis, to be pastoral is to be with the people in their place. She's critical of what she sees as a dominant Eurocentric approach to theology that can become detached from the struggles of everyday people, especially those on the margins of society.
She's saying it's too focused on abstract ideas and not enough on the real lives of people, especially those who are often overlooked.
Exactly. And she argues that theology needs to be informed by the lived wisdom of the people.
That's a pretty big challenge to the traditional way of doing theology.
For sure. And Higgins also points to a subtle but important shift in how Francis talks about the poor.
I'm curious about that.
So, liberation theology, which emerged in Latin America, frequently uses the phrase preferential option of the poor.
Right.
This suggests that the poor have a unique understanding of God and justice. While Francis clearly shares a deep concern for the poor, he uses a slightly different phrase, preferential option for the poor.
It sounds like a small distinction, but I'm sure it has significant implications.
Absolutely. It's about calling on theologians and the whole church to actively engage with and prioritize the needs of the marginalized, rather than seeing them as simply having a special theological insight.
So it's not just about listening to the poor, but actually taking concrete actions to address their needs and concerns.
Right. And as Kuda puts it, theologians need to come down and live the realities of the poor and marginalized.
So this isn't just a change in vocabulary. It's a whole new way of approaching and doing theology.
Absolutely.
And Francis actually laid out his vision in a formal document, didn't he?
He did. In his 2023 apostolic letter, Ad Theologiam Promovendum,
Right.
Higgins highlights that this letter, significantly, came out right after the first session of the Synod on Synodality, and it outlines Francis's vision for the future direction of theological study and reflection.
And what are the key takeaways from this letter?
The big thing that stands out is Francis's emphasis on a fundamentally contextual theology. Basically, he argues that theology needs to be able to interpret the gospel in the specific conditions where people live. Geographic, social, and cultural contexts all play a role. It can be a one-size-fits-all approach dictated from the top down.
It has to be grounded in the lived experience of diverse communities.
Precisely. He also stresses that theology needs to develop within a culture of dialogue and encounter. That means not just among academics, but in conversation with believers and non-believers alike.
So opening up the conversation and engaging with a wider range of perspectives.
Yes. And he's calling for theologians to take into account insights from areas like social sciences and the experiences of ordinary people.
It's really about broadening the scope of theological inquiry and making it more relevant to the world we live in.
Exactly. And he explicitly states that we can't just keep rehashing old ideas and formulas.
Right, that's an important point.
He says, to promote theology in the future, we cannot limit ourselves to abstractly reproposing formulas and schemes from the past. And he emphasizes that God has revealed himself as history, not as a collection of abstract truths.
So theology needs to be a living and evolving field of study, responding to the challenges and realities of our time.
Absolutely.
So all this sounds very theoretical. How does it play out in the real world? How does this new approach to theology actually change how the church functions on a day-to-day basis?
Well, this is where the whole idea of the synodal approach comes in.
Right.
When we say synodal, think of it as a more collaborative, participatory way for the church to make decisions and discern God's will. It involves getting broader input from different sectors of the church.
It sounds more democratic, more inclusive.
Exactly. And Higgins really emphasizes the importance of a meeting of Latin American bishops back in 2007 called Silum Apuricita. They used a method called Conversations in the Spirit, which heavily influenced Francis's style.
Okay, and how does that method work?
Well, the working document, known as the Instrumentum Laboris for the 2023 Synod on Synodality, really lays out the core elements. It's about deep listening to each other, journeying together with a real focus on people's actual lives, paying attention to specific situations, and understanding communion as a lived encounter with everyone having a meaningful role to play.
It sounds less about top-down pronouncements and more about grassroots engagement and dialogue.
Precisely. And Francis has been actively working to make the synod itself more representative and more impactful.
How so?
He's made it clear he wants the synod to better reflect the global church.
Okay.
This means greater involvement from lay people, more women, increased representation from non-European countries, even including other Christian denominations in discussions with Rome. He also wants the church to be more outward-looking, tackling major global issues like environmental destruction.
Wow, that's quite ambitious.
Yes, it is. And a significant step came in 2021 when he granted voting rights to lay people participating in the synod. This clearly clearly shows his commitment to broader participation.
That's a big change.
It is. And Higgins makes an interesting observation here. He says that by doing all this Jesuit disruptor pope is actually being true to the organic development of church tradition, not abandoning it.
So it's a kind of disruption that's actually rooted in a deep respect for tradition.
Exactly. And this brings us back to that seeming contradiction, the idea that Francis can be both a disruptor and a preserver of tradition.
Right. It's like he's shaking things up, but also holding on to what's essential.
Yes, and Higgins addresses this directly. He explains that while Francis has definitely disrupted established patterns and priorities within the church, he hasn't actually changed core doctrines through papal decrees or anything like that.
So no sweeping pronouncements or attempts to rewrite long-standing teachings.
No. And he hasn't rejected traditional forms of worship or dismissed the contributions of previous popes. Instead, Higgins says he's building on their scaffolding.
So a continuation, but with some pretty major renovations.
You could put it that way. And Higgins argues that the real target of Francis's disruption our ways of understanding the gospel may have become too limited, too stuck in old ways of thinking.
He's challenging us to think outside the box, to see things from fresh perspectives.
Yes, and to move beyond what Higgins calls our ahistorical sense of the church. This idea that the church has always been exactly as it is now, ignoring its long history of development and change.
Right. It's about recognizing the church as a living, evolving entity.
Exactly. And to illustrate this point, Higgins shares a rather charming anecdote about Christopher House's accidental visit to the Metropolitan Cathedral in Liverpool.
Okay, tell me about that.
House was actually planning to see the Anglican cathedral, but somehow he ended up at the Catholic one, known locally as Paddy's Wigwam. What's interesting is the series of unplanned encounters he has there.
Oh.
He's told he needs to undertake a Jubilee year pilgrimage, then he's directed to the holy water. He has this interaction with the security guard.
All these seemingly insignificant moments.
But they add up to a certain atmosphere, and notably, the priest leading the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament was from Africa, which highlights the changing demographics of the priesthood in Europe.
So little details that revealed a bigger picture.
Exactly. And then, even without knowing about the Pope's health at that moment, House feels compelled to pray for him, connecting this to the Pilgrimage of Hope, which was Francis's own initiative.
So a kind of unplanned connection to the Pope's message of hope.
Yes, it's a collection of small moments that suggest a church that feels less rigid, more open, and more globally connected.
More in line with Francis's vision.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to that core idea of Pope Francis as a figure who embraces mercy and disrupts complacency.
Right. Two sides of the same coin.
Higgins points to the image of the care of mercy as a defining characteristic of Francis's papacy, from his very first encyclical, Lumen Fidei, all the way through Misericordia et Misera, his letter on mercy.
And what's the central focus of this emphasis on mercy?
It's all about those who are on the margins of society.
Okay.
Not just those who are materially poor, but also those who are spiritually lost or hurting. The recurring image is of the church as a field hospital, constantly working to heal wounds.
So a very active, engaged role for the church in the world.
Yes. And Higgins connects this to Francis's actions as well as his words. He mentions his trip to East Timor, where he used a wheelchair, symbolizing his outreach to even the most distant communities.
A powerful image.
Definitely. And Higgins also emphasizes the importance of spiritual discernment in understanding Francis's approach. This is rooted in Ignatian spirituality.
Right.
It's about focusing on personal experience, understanding one's inner movements, and finding God in all things.
So a very personal and experiential approach to faith.
Yes.
And to bring it all together, we're seeing a pope who's making what some might consider radical calls for change, but those calls are deeply rooted in the traditions of the church.
Precisely. He resists easy categorization by political labels, whether left or right.
Right. He seeks to transcend those categories.
Exactly. Instead, his focus remains on those on the peripheries, on building a more inclusive and welcoming church. It's a complex and nuanced approach, and it's definitely having a huge impact.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main takeaway about Pope Francis?
These sources paint a portrait of Pope Francis as a really complex and dynamic figure, someone who's actively reshaping the Catholic Church.
Okay.
And he's doing this through this profound commitment to mercy, always highlighting the need to care for those who are hurting, and by intentionally challenging ingrained ways of thinking within the church. He's pushing for a rethinking of traditional approaches to theology and church practice.
How so?
He's prioritizing lived experience, dialogue, and the needs of the marginalized, all while remaining grounded in the essential traditions of the Catholic faith. It's a fascinating balancing act.
Absolutely. And on that note, here's a final thought for our listeners to consider. How might this paradigm shift within the Catholic Church offer lessons for navigating other complex and tradition-bound institutions in our often chaotic world? Or even for examining your own personal belief systems? Think about that delicate balance, the need to challenge old ways of thinking while preserving core values, and the power of empathy and lived experience in shaping our understanding of the world and our place in it.
It's a question worth pondering.
It definitely is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.